Hello boys and girls. Today we're going to read Mr. Impossible by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Mr. Impossible by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Impossible could do the most amazing things. For instance, Mr. Impossible could jump over a house. You try jumping over a house. It's impossible. There's Mr. Impossible jumping over the house. And Mr. Impossible could make himself invisible. All he had to do was stand there and think about becoming invisible, and he became invisible. You try it. It's impossible. There's Mr. Impossible becoming invisible. And Mr. Impossible could fly. All he had to do was stand there and flap his arms about, and off he flew. You try it. It's impossible. There's Mr. Impossible flying. And Mr. Impossible lived in an impossible looking house. Have you ever seen a house in such an impossible place? Of course not. There's the house, and the house is in a tree. That's impossible. One day, Mr. Impossible was out walking in the woods when he met a boy called William. William was on his way to school. "Hello," said Mr. Impossible. "Hello," replied William. "I'm William." "I'm impossible," said Mr. Impossible. "Really?" said William. "Really," smiled Mr. Impossible. There's William and Mr. Impossible meeting for the first time. "Can you do impossible things?" asked William. "Haven't come across anything I couldn't do," replied Mr. Impossible modestly. William thought. "Can you climb up that tree?" he asked, pointing to the biggest tree in the wood. "I can do better than that," replied Mr. Impossible. "I can walk up that tree." And he did. There he is, walking up the tree. William thought again. "Can you stand on one hand?" he asked. "I can do better than that," replied Mr. Impossible. "I can stand on no hands." And he did. "That's impossible," cried Mr. Williams. "True," replied Mr. Impossible. There he is, standing on no hands. That's impossible. Then William remembered that he was on his way to school. "Why don't you come with me?" he asked. "But I've never been to a school before," Mr. Impossible said. "Then it's time you did," replied William. "Come on." There's William asking Mr. Impossible if he'd like to go to school with him. I think they're going to have an adventure at school. Mr. William and Mr. Impossible sat at the back of William's classroom with all the other children. The teacher came in but didn't notice that there was somebody extra in his class that morning. There's all the children, and right there is Mr. Impossible. "Good morning, children," said the teacher. "I have a very difficult sum for you to do today. It will take you most of the morning to work out the answer." And he wrote the sum on the blackboard. There's the teacher writing the sum on the blackboard. He's got a very difficult sum. It really was the most difficult sum William had ever seen in his whole life. Full of multiplications and divisions and additions and other things William didn't enjoy. Only Katie loves those things. The teacher was right. It would indeed take most of the morning to work out the answer, if not most of the afternoon as well. Mr. Impossible whispered in William's ear. There's William, and there's Mr. Impossible whispering in William's ear. William put up his hand. "Yes, William," said the teacher. "Is there something about the sum that you don't understand?" "Please, sir," said William, "is the answer 23? The teacher was very, absolutely, totally, completely amazed. "How did you work out the sum so quickly?" he gasped. "It's impossible." "Nothing is impossible," said Mr. Impossible from the back of the class, and stood up. "Well, I never did," exclaimed the teacher. There's the teacher, seeing Mr. Impossible for the first time, thinking that it's impossible. Oh. After that, Mr. Impossible spent all day at the school. He showed the teacher how he could read a book upside down. That's impossible, said the children who were watching. Absolutely, replied Mr. Impossible. There's Mr. Impossible reading the book upside down. Then William asked Mr. Impossible if he would like to play in the school football match. Oh, yes, please, replied Mr. Impossible. I've never played football before. And do you know what he did? He kicked the football so high into the air that when it came down, it had snow on it. What an impossible thing to do. There he is, kicking the football high into the air, and it's coming back down with snow. Seems impossible to me. Then it was time to go home. Mr. Impossible said goodbye to all the people at the school and said goodbye to William. Goodbye, Mr. Impossible, said William. Goodbye, William, said Mr. Impossible, and just disappeared. William rubbed his eyes and went home. There he is, walking home from school again. William's mother and father were waiting for him. Hello, William, they said. Did you have a good day at school? Yes, replied William, and I met somebody who could do anything in the world. Really, William? They both laughed. You're impossible. William smiled and went inside. And 100 miles away, a small figure was listening to what William's mother and father were saying. And he grinned an impossible grin, and then he went to sleep, standing on his head. And we all know that's impossible. Mr. Impossible by Roger Hargreaves.